Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. It is often said that free speech is the cornerstone to a democratic society. However, in our democracy here in Canada, it seems that speech isn't all that free sometimes anymore. Say the wrong thing and you can get doxxed or cancelled. And good luck to you in determining who decides what the wrong thing to say is, as the goalposts are ever changing and so is the judge. One area of society where one would hope for free speech or academic freedom ought to be protected and at all costs is in academia, at universities. But are universities bastions of academic freedom any longer? One recent survey demonstrated that universities are nearly devoid of diversity in thought and are at risk of becoming politically homogenous institutions. Not only are professors espousing nearly identical political and social views, but those who espouse dissenting views self-censor out of fear of retaliation. So why does this matter? Why is it important to have academic freedom? And how did we get to this point? And perhaps most importantly, is there any way of getting back? Well, joining me now to share his research is Dr. Christopher Dummit, Professor of Canadian Studies at Trent University and co-author of the recently published report by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, The Viewpoint Diversity Crisis at Canadian Universities. Thank you, Dr. Dummit, for joining me today. I appreciate your time. So let's jump right in. We'll start with a very basic question is, what is academic freedom and why is it so important?
I mean, academic freedom is the principle that professors at universities, that people in universities should be free to research where their research and their research interests take them, that they should be free to comment on intellectual issues, public issues, based on their research expertise, and that they should be free from the kind of constraints, whether it's from especially universities or governments, that would limit the kinds of debates that could happen. It's developed, especially in the last 40, 50 years, incredible protections in Canada about academic freedom, although they seem now to be under threat more recently.
Okay, and just walk us through some of the numbers, because you published a very good report. Just how monolithic have Canadian universities become? Like, how big of a problem is this?
Well, we wanted to find out because there had been a bunch of studies in the US and the UK that had sort of said that universities were becoming more homogenous, really. Many people were thinking alike, at least politically, at the universities. And so we didn't have good Canadian data. And we went out and did a survey of Canadian professors and found, if you look at who professors vote for, and then secondly, how they self-identify, they self-identify as on the left or on the right. And we found that roughly 88% of professors either vote for left-wing parties and self-identify as being on the left. So it's a huge discrepancy compared to the public at large.
Okay, and when you say left-wing parties, what were the parameters? Like, what was considered a left-wing party?
We wanted to find out what they were, because obviously the Liberal Party, obviously the NDP would obviously be on the left. The Liberal Party, we weren't sure. We thought, we wanted to leave it open. It has been in the center in the past. And so we asked professors who voted for the Liberals, where did they identify? And 95% of professors who voted Liberal consider themselves on the left. So we assume then if 95% of professors are voting Liberal or assuming they're on the left, then at least they are seeing it as a left-leaning party.
And I guess then that leaves the Conservative Party federally on the right?
Conservatives, the People's Party, and there's also the Green and the Bloc Québécois. But again, we looked at those numbers to determine what professors who are voting for these parties and how do they see themselves, and so that's why we use the two numbers together. And we're pretty confident that those numbers are accurate.
That's actually a very good methodology, so I appreciate that, because it's how one sees themselves as well as how, I guess, we see the parties on a spectrum. You gave some very good numbers. Professors vote overwhelmingly for parties on the left. 88% self-identify as left-leaning, with only 9% voting for Conservative parties, compared to 30% more generally in the broader public. Is this surprising?
Sorry, I don't mean to correct it, but compared to 39% in the general public.
Oh, 39%. Okay, yeah. Excellent. Yeah, no, I don't want to get your research wrong. Is this alarming? Why is this surprising to you, and why should we be alarmed?
Well, it's not surprising anecdotally, but it's very nice to have the numbers to back it up. I think we should be alarmed because, I think universities have always been sort of liberal institutions, open-minded institutions, but there's a lot of evidence to think that it's got more dramatic, that balance is becoming more skewed. And what we know about institutions where everyone basically thinks alike is that those kinds of institutions tend to make a lot of mistakes, so that they lead to self-censorship on the part of those who don't, follow the line on certain issues.
Welcome back. We're discussing academic freedom and exploring to see if there's actually a viewpoint diversity crisis at Canadian universities. And joining me is Dr. Christopher Dummit, a professor of Canadian Studies at Trent University. Now, again, Professor Dummit, it was a fascinating study, and I really encourage everybody who wants to read it to go to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute webpage and they can look it up. But we're talking about academic freedom and why that's important. Why is it important that there is a diversity of viewpoints at universities? So please pick up where you left off.
Yeah, I think it's really important that universities that are literally bastions of kind of our expertise about what's true about the world, what we want to question about the world, that they need to get things right. And we know that institutions where many people think alike on certain key issues, they just make mistakes, and they make mistakes for a bunch of important reasons. People who might have a different opinion but are kind of frightened to speak it out, even just for social reasons, will not give either important viewpoints or important facts. And so institutions where people think alike, whether it's universities or juries or judges, they would tend to make a lot of errors in those cases, because they're not really fostering an open and frank discussion. And universities should be the place where we're most interested in getting really the broadest range of viewpoints represented. And the research suggests that homogenous organizations just won't allow that to happen.
Well, it sounds, based on what you're sharing with me here, it sounds that almost as if there's been a closing of Canadian universities, that in fact we are not small L liberal, where we have a plethora of idea exchange and as academic freedom to discuss things and to explore new ideas, but in fact we've become closed-minded. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I would say it's not always intentionally. I mean, it might be intentional on some parts, but certainly the effect when you have organizations where everyone thinks alike on certain issues. There are other issues where you can have incredible debate, and so it seems like there's great debates. I mean, if you think about it in terms of painters, you can have 600 shades of red or 300 shades of orange. So it seems like there's this really diversity of perspectives. But when no one's painting in blue, it's striking that no one's painting in blue. And so that's what you really need to think about, the way in which certain things get left out. And as I say, it doesn't even have to be intentional, and probably in the most part isn't intentional.
Now, again, further into more of your research, you said when you asked professors if they would be worried if their political opinions became known, almost 88% of the left-leaning professors were either not very worried or not worried at all. However, when you looked at the right-leaning majority, the situation changed. What happened?
Yeah, when we asked those questions about whether they were, even just worried about their political opinions becoming known, over 40% of right-leaning professors said that they'd be scared just to have someone know their political viewpoints. And then we asked a variety of questions about other issues, more precise issues about gender issues, or about EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and the numbers remain between 40 and 50% of people frightened, not even to teach on these issues, which is one thing we found as well, but just even to have someone know their personal political opinion. And in an institution that is predominantly, as we say, 88% of faculty are on the left, you can see why people on the left just aren't really concerned about this. They're unlikely to face any consequences, but the political minorities obviously feel quite differently.
Well, it doesn't sound like universities are a very tolerant place of diverging viewpoints these days, does it? How is it for students? I appreciate that your survey did not canvas students, but do you think it's a different situation for students? Are they afforded more academic freedom than a professor because they're paying to be there versus the other way around?
It doesn't seem to be the case. No, actually, colleagues of ours have done a student survey which isn't published yet. So I do know the results of a student survey which is done pretty similar to ours. And I know they found quite similar things, that there was a great deal of concern about inability to speak in class, outside of class. And the numbers were in some ways quite similar. It's complicated, though, in the sense that there was also, in some ways, especially in English Canada, a kind of a willingness to cancel other students, or to think other students should self-censor themselves. Because and our study found this as well, that the younger you went, that the younger faculty were more likely to support kind of canceling someone else. And I think the student research found, again, among students, obviously on average a younger group, that they also were more supportive of closing down topics of discussion.
It's just shocking to have a conversation with a professor on how we have like almost a systemic closing down of topics of discussion at universities. I mean, it's just jarring to me. There should be a place where we can have ideas exchanged. My goodness, I explored so many various ideas when I was at university. I encourage my children to do the same. Don't take my word for it. Do your research. Come up with your own ideas. How is this going to harm the quality of student we're churning out?
Well, if it continued, it would be incredibly negative. We wouldn't be fostering real and genuine discussion. I mean, there's a great essay by an American recently talked about the process as one that creates structural stupidity. Structural stupidity, and I love that because it basically if you don't face if you're not faced with intelligent, thoughtful arguments from those with whom you disagree. This is John Stuart Mill said this. You don't really know your own opinion.
Welcome back. We're talking about that perennial favorite topic, academic freedom and free speech and all that good stuff from Canadian universities. And joining me is Dr. Christopher Dummit. He's a professor of Canadian Studies at Trent University. And I say it's all that good stuff because really, Dr. Dummit, again, I said this before and I'll say it again, we really want that freedom of thought and freedom of expression and that academic freedom at universities because, you were on a point there just before commercial. What happens if we don't have that?
Yeah, I think I was calling it structural stupidity, which is building on John Stuart Mill's idea that you only really know your own opinion when you know really the best versions of the opinions of those who would disagree with you. And this is what we've been teaching in universities for decades or certainly maybe even centuries. Really, that you really need to understand that the total variety of thoughts and opinions and evidence around an issue before you can really come to have a firm and very good opinion yourself.
Now, well, then let's do that. Let's have a different opinion here than perhaps you and I are discussing. So there might be some professors, so you said this figure sits around 88% of left-leaning or self-identifying left-leaning professors. Perhaps for them, they view these other viewpoints as completely intolerant. Perhaps they're completely discriminatory and there really ought not to be an airspace for such a viewpoint or perspective. Is that the case and is that appropriate in the context of a university?
Yeah, so those are exactly some of the arguments we faced when we presented this evidence. Some of the kind of quick fire kind of Twitter responses. Oh, it's good that people self-censor because they're racists or sexists or insert your ists word or it's good that the other comment is that of course universities are more left-leaning because people on the right are uneducated and stupid. And these are the kinds of comments you get from people with PhDs. On social media. It's one of the reasons I'm not on social media anymore, because I think it leads to this kind of structural stupidity. So those are the kind of arguments you have. And I think I think they're an example of the structural stupidity which is overtaking universities, because these kinds of comments are allowed to kind of float out there because they're not facing real life people who are espousing different viewpoints intelligently and thoughtfully in a kind of one-on-one conversations like you and I are having here. And so they're using these ad hominem attacks. They're kind of calling people names, and they're not really forced to face thoughtful discussions where someone might disagree on, the particular way that you might want to counter discrimination society, which many people would say is important, but you might have criticisms about certain kinds of EDI policies. And these kinds of responses say, well, any criticism of any EDI, well, it must be racist. And so you can easily discount it. And when you're working in an institution where 88% of the people are come from a certain perspective, it's much more likely that those kinds of very easy, flippant, really structurally stupid comments will pass unnoticed.
Now, you mentioned that, or in your research, it was revealed that a certain percentage of professors who lean right, say 40%, they feel like they face a hostile work environment, and that if they made their viewpoints known, that there would be negative repercussions. What are some of the consequences if again, so-called right-leaning professor expresses their opinion? Are there actual tangible consequences?
Well, our research didn't thoroughly investigate that, but we got a lot of anecdotal responses back from people in our survey, and they can be anything from the things that about that are very high dramatic cancellations, student campaigns online to get someone fired or a lecture canceled. Those are the things that people hear about. I think there are smaller scale things which other studies have shown where you're worried that in applying for promotion, in applying to have a a grant, get a grant, or to have a publication, you're worried that people on the committee will be able to know who you are, to know your viewpoints, and will find other ways to discriminate against you. And there have been a few studies which show that only a minority of professors would discriminate based on politics, but that those numbers, given that the total percentage of the universities are so left-leaning, that those numbers can be really serious in and of themselves. Even if only a minority are discriminating, it can have a real impact.
And I know we've danced around this point, but I'd like to ask it square up. Is there a double standard in universities depending on your political leanings?
I mean, there could be. I certainly think it's easier, from what I was just saying, it's easier for kind of weak arguments to get by when people agree in principle with those things. Although I would say that when you're on the left and you're writing those things, often there's incredible, fascinating debate, and you can have these amazing discussions amongst all these variations of kinds of arguments within a very narrow spectrum. So that's still rigorous, but it's rigorous within a smaller circle of ideas.
Right, and I suppose in that point, it doesn't allow for as much of a robust discussion and a free flow exchange of ideas.
Certain comments are assumed, certain questions are off limits, but as long as you kind of don't acknowledge that, then it seems like there's a vibrant and robust discussion, which to a certain extent there is.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, we're going to pick this discussion up right when we get back, because I'd like to know, well, if it's a problem, can we fix it? We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion with Dr. Christopher Dummit, who's a professor of Canadian Studies at Trent University, and we're discussing academic freedom at universities in Canada. You've highlighted, Dr. Dummit, a plethora of concern. There's a large concern that academic freedom has been eroded at university campuses. Is this a problem that has gone too far to correct?
I don't think so. I certainly hope not. And there's a lot of examples around the world now where other kind of jurisdictions are beginning to think about this. So in the UK, for example, the UK government just passed a new academic freedom bill, which seeks to enshrine academic freedom as a kind of thing that universities must protect. So it's not just something having a free speech statement, but it's something that from the top down, the government will enshrine that universities must protect academic freedom. In Quebec last year, and it's still just passing, Bill 32 proposes a similar kind of thing in Quebec, where each university would be kind of mandated to have an academic freedom committee, which would be in charge of promoting the values of academic freedom, but then also being a place where if there seems to be an infringement on academic freedom in the university, this is somewhere that professors or students could go to have those concerns aired.
It seems so strange that we have to have a committee adjudicating academic freedom. It almost seems hypocritical almost, but I can understand that clearly we're at some of a tipping point. So you mentioned, I read through your report, you mentioned there were some good things that we could do to ameliorate the situation. You mentioned, for example, and I know you highlighted that the UK just did this, the creation of an Academic Freedom Act. How would that help?
Yeah, I think I kind of envision this. I think we need to work on it. I envision this working something like the kind of the Canada Health Act, which I'm not sure how your listeners know about this. It's kind of basically a statement of very certain number of principles, which says, the provinces across the country have to maintain certain standards in order to get federal funding for universities. And I think something like this could work for academic freedom, where the province, they don't want to get involved. Provinces don't want to get involved in kind of controlling and regulating universities, but they would say, listen, academic freedom matters. These are the principles of academic freedom. And as long as you abide by these principles, funding will flow through to the universities just as it always would. But if you don't abide by academic freedom, then there could be kind of financial consequences. And I think that's a really nice hands-off approach to regulation, which essentially doesn't regulate unless something goes really badly wrong.
Now, another one you mentioned is that you think it should be insisted upon that universities remain politically neutral in their public statements. And even with their hiring practices. And that, of course, has been a contentious issue for a number of years about how universities hire, to whom they offer tenure, et cetera. How do you think that would ameliorate the situation?
I mean, I think it's worth making explicit in an Academic Freedom Act that you'd have to put political neutrality, because I think kind of really almost unnoticed, a whole host of ways in which universities hire become kind of politicized in ways that aren't quite clear. Like you can, and you'll see job ads in universities that advertise in very precise areas and say, critical approaches to such and such. And, someone from the public might not understand what critical approaches is. And critical approaches is a very particular radical left-leaning approach to a certain topic. And on the surface of it, it just seems like a job ad, but actually it's a job ad which is targeted only to people who have a certain political perspective. And there are other examples of that. And I think universities have been getting away with this, essentially discriminating politically on who they could hire. And they shouldn't be allowed to get away with this kind of viewpoint discrimination.
Another suggestion that you had is legislate that unions cannot discriminate based on politics in the defense of their members. Why is that important?
I mean, I think right now the biggest protection professors have is through the academic freedom provisions and collective agreements. And unions, of course, some unions are very good at protecting that, but it depends on the actual local union and their executive. And given the political makeup of the university, many faculty aren't sure they can always trust their union. And maybe their fears are not based in reality, but it's hard to know in each particular case. And I think it would be worthwhile really making explicit the obligation of unions to do that.
Okay, we only have 30 seconds left. Generally promote a culture of academic freedom. What are a few quick things that one can do to do that?
Every new student and every new faculty comes in gets talked about and told about the importance of academic freedom in doing their job and being a student at university.
Okay, so there is hope. We might be able to turn this around then in Canada?
I really hope so.
Okay, excellent. Well, Dr. Christopher Dummit, once again, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing your student report when you release that one next.
Thanks.
Well, if Canada is truly a diverse society, then we need to be diverse also in thought. And if, from what we've heard today, the universities are becoming more monolithic and lack diversity in thought and opinion and research, well, then probably that has to change. That's called academic freedom. And that's a good thing, because through academic freedom, then we can invent and create and grow as a society. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.